The difference between this sound and this sound is just reverb. It is simply one of the most important phenomena in sound, for good or for bad. It is why the same instrument will sound completely different outdoors compared to inside a concert hall. It is why there's an epidemic of people on TikTok singing in parking garages.
I remember when I lost my mind. Woo!
And it is also why buying those tickets at the back of Wembley Stadium was not your brightest idea. So it doesn't come as a surprise that it is also one of the most essential aspects of making music. Musicians will play differently depending on the reverb of the room, because it changes how they sound and they get feedback from it. It's especially true for organists, whose instruments are literally the size of a building. In this case, we can say that the room is part of the instrument. Some of the techniques used to create artificial reverb in the studio have such an iconic sound that they created the whole aesthetics to certain genres.
With the element reverb, it actually has a reverb tank that you attach to it that creates the reverb sound. And that's how I get those cool whips and shots.
When you've recorded something, there are so many ways to add a reverb to it. The oldest one in the book is the simplest. You go to a room with a lot of reverb, you play the sound on a speaker, and you capture it back on a microphone. This is called an echo chamber. Then came springs, which have the sound passing through one or multiple springs and making them vibrate. Then came plates, basically the same thing just with a big sheet of metal. And as early as the 70s, digital algorithmic reverb that first came in the form of hardware units, and then what's more commonly used today in the form of software that you can run on your computer. A good thing with algorithmic reverb is that you're not limited to some physical space or device, and you can do pretty much whatever you want, creating spaces from literally out of this world. The problem is when you're going for a realistic, acoustic-like reverb, because we're creating the sound of a real room with all of the reflections bouncing on the walls and how different surfaces will absorb, reflect, diffuse, or diffract an incoming wave at different frequencies, and expecting your computer to run this in real time.
Oh my god, this kid knows what they're doing! Love that! Dude, this is impressive! Yes!
But a clever solution to this appeared 2 decades ago. In 1999, Sony released the first ever convolution reverb, in which you could load CDs into it, containing the reverb of various real rooms. And 2 years later, the first ever software plugin to do that got released, Altiverb. And today it is still one of the best ones out there, so we're gonna use it as a reference later. The idea of convolution reverb takes advantage of a fundamental aspect of digital audio. And so that we can understand how it works, I'm gonna go on a quick overview of how and why digital audio works. The digital world is made of ones and zeros. It can't store a continuous analog waveform. So, digital audio signals are encoded in individual samples, each of them indicating the level of the signal at a given point in time. These samples are captured at a constant rate, which is called the sampling rate. And in order to capture an analog waveform perfectly, the Nyquist-Shannon sampling theorem says that the sampling rate must be greater than 2 times the highest frequency in the analog signal. In other words, because humans can hear up to 20 kHz, we want to capture and reproduce sound up to that limit. So we want the sample rate to be greater than double that, 40 kHz. And if we want to convert it back to the original continuous analog signal, the most basic way to do it is just to connect the samples like stair steps. These little jumps in energy will just produce distortion above 20 kHz that we can easily remove with the filter. And then we're back to the original analog signal. It might seem weird that just these samples can perfectly reproduce the accuracy and smoothness of the analog signal, but think of it this way. How many points do you need to describe a circle? Do you need an infinite amount of them to draw it? No, actually you just need 2 points, because all you need to know is where the center is and the length of the radius. And you might wonder, what do circles have to do with sound? Well, you just need to boop and pew. Sorry if I'm speaking in scientific terms, okay? So, just like circles, a digital signal can perfectly reproduce a pure frequency wave with just 2 samples per cycle.
Actually, we have so slightly more than 2 because when the frequency is equal to the sample rate, samples can align with 0 process of the wave, making all samples 0 so the waveform captured or reduced. Although the phase of the wave has to be at an exact value in theory, in the real world, samples can be encoded with infinite precision, creating rounding errors which we call quantization errors. So this effect will happen in a range of phase values where the samples align with the wave when its amplitude is below half of the least significant bit. The exact headroom we need to have in the sample rate is dependent on the bit depth of the samples. Let's not confuse with headroom given to 48.41 kilograms that we use today, because this has to do with the filters used in conversion between analog and digital signals, which is way more than sufficient to resolve this basic degree of analog frequency with bit depths. So this effect is completely ignored in the real world. This was just to explain why the sampling theorem says greater than and not greater than or equal.
Mathematik. Hans gets the Flammenwerfer. Jawohl!
So the idea of convolution reverb is that if digital audio is made of those individual impulses, what if we take one single impulse, play it on a speaker inside a real room, and capture it back on a microphone? What you'll capture contains the reverb of the room. It's the sonic fingerprint of the space. We call it an impulse response, or IR for short. And if we take this IR and replace every single impulse of a digital recording with it, in a process known as convolution, we get something that pretty much sounds the same as if you actually play the recording back on the speaker in the room. You might think, alright, that's it, this is the most realistic way of doing reverb possible. There is no way that you can beat the sound being actually played back in the room.
Where's the trash? Behind you. I'm talking.
No directivity controls. Magnitude and phase distortion. Their dynamic range.
Dog shit.
Completely sure of the math.
My math specialist, look at him. You notice anything different about him? Look at his face.
There's still some issues with convolution reverb. You see people saying that it is fixed in place and does not recreate the movements of real musicians in a real space. But unless you're recording that guy, I don't think it makes a difference. But to me, the real audible issues come from this. The speaker that we use to create those IRs. A normal speaker like this one is omnidirectional in the lows and directional in the mids and highs. So if I flip it, you still hear the low end, but the rest is muffled. And what happens on the sides is also important, because if you're not standing exactly in front of it, well, that's what you're gonna hear directly, but even if you are exactly in front, you can still hear what happens on the sides if you happen to have surfaces on which the sound can bounce and come back to you. So this is a fairly good but cheap speaker, and its sound is not very consistent on the sides. That's why on high quality speakers you usually see things like waveguides, and part of the role is to help control this dispersion. And on the fanciest models, you'll even see the different drivers sharing the same axis, so that wherever you are, you'll always be at the same distance with all of them. But Most instruments do not disperse sound like speakers. For example, brass instruments are also directional in the highs, but much more than your average speaker. The high end of these instruments comes out as a very focused beam, so the overall reverb they generate will be darker compared to a speaker because the very high end doesn't spread as much in the room. On the other hand, a snare drum is mostly omnidirectional in every frequency. So the reverb it produces is much brighter relative to a speaker. The directivity of an instrument can actually be measured by placing microphones all around the instrument in an anechoic chamber. Here are some visualizations of energy as a function of direction. Here in the low end of the trumpet at 200 Hz. Here the mids at 2 kHz. You start to see the pressure beaming out of the horn. And here's what it looks like at 12 kHz. Alright, so let me show you this difference with a harp, which is a very omnidirectional instrument. This one from Orchestral Tools has been recorded in Telex, which is a quite large and reflective studio in Berlin. Here it's loaded with a closed mic alongside a real room mic. But I'm gonna compare it to just the closed mic alongside an impulse response of the same room. So let's see how it compares. So you can hear that the impulse response is darker, and that's because the speaker the high end of the speaker doesn't spread as much as a real harp. That's not to say that it sounds bad, it's just different from what happens in real life. So what is actually done today to create reverb from sources with specific dispersions like real instruments? A few months ago, famous virtual instrument developer Spitfire Audio tackled this problem in their Air Studio's Reverb plugin. What they did is capturing multiple IRs with the speakers rotated in 5 different directions, which you can then blend in the plugin. So while it's not as accurate as the real dispersion of an instrument, it's still better than nothing.
But wait, there's more.
Speakers produce different frequencies at different time, often the bass being delayed from the rest. And this will affect every single reflection of the reverb. But also, sometimes you just want to apply a bit of reverb, so you will combine both the dry, unprocessed signal and the reverb. And because the speaker delays some frequencies, you're gonna get some heavy phase cancellation between the dry signal and the direct sound of the speaker. You know, like this, and we don't want that. Currently, the way to deal with it is just to cut the beginning of the IR, but because of those frequency delays from the speaker and something called the Gibbs phenomenon, to completely remove the direct sound of the speaker from an IR, you will have to remove the first tens of milliseconds, and this will usually remove the first reflections of the reverb. So this floor here disappears from the reverb, same for this wall here. And if you cut it earlier so that you keep those first reflections, like in this plugin called Inspirata, the direct sound is gonna miss low end, which will spill into the reverb. So in this plugin, even if you cut the direct sound, although you keep the first reflections, you'll still end up with big phasing issues in the low end when the unprocessed signal is combined. But is there a better way to approach this? Something that will give you both the ability to flawlessly separate the direct sound from the reverb and actually generate the reverb like an instrument would? Well, for the past few years or so, I've been working on something just like that. Let me introduce you to wave-based reverb. The idea is that a truly realistic algorithmic reverb can't be processed in real time, and convolution reverb based on IRs of real spaces is too limited because of how it's measured. So, let's use a highly accurate sounding reverb algorithm with detailed 3D models of rooms in which we could load virtual sources with specific dispersions like real instruments, with none of the limitations that come from a real speaker, so no coloration at all, and with the ability to flawlessly separate the different elements of the reverb. And from that, let's just bake IRs out of it that we can process in real time. And you know what?
That's the sound.
Acoustic simulation software is not something new. It has been used for decades by acousticians to anticipate the behavior of sound in concert halls, stadiums, lecture halls, etc., without being on site, or even before the room is built. Traditionally, these software have been using something called geometrical acoustics, where reflections are calculated by tracing the path of the sound. And although they are sort of okay at predicting specific metrics of rooms, they are not designed to sound good. After putting to the test some of the most established software out there, this 2019 study concludes that the difference between simulated and measured IRs of the same scene was always clearly audible. Room acoustical simulations are not yet suitable to accurately predict the perceptual properties of sound sources in virtual acoustics environments at the current state of the art. However, recently, from Icelandic startup Treble to the open source project Waveverb, we've seen some software being released using a more modern kind of acoustics modeling called wave-based simulation. Instead of tracing the path of reflections like geometrical acoustics do, wave-based acoustics model air as a volume. The space inside the room is chopped into a 3D grid, a bit like an analog waveform is sampled. With this method, you can simulate how each point in the 3D grid interacts with its neighbors. It's kind of like simulating the particles of air, just on a bigger scale. This has the advantage of simulating all behaviors of sound, including diffraction, where geometrical acoustics usually fail. Look at this comparison between the two, and you can see that geometrical acoustics fail to propagate sound at the bottom because it doesn't model diffraction. And by the way, here we are talking about modeling reverb, but wave-based acoustics are not limited to just modeling air. It is possible that in the future, sound effects in animated movies will be purely generated by the animation itself. But a big limitation of wave-based acoustics is that it obeys the very same Nyquist-Shannon theorem of sampling. But now that we are dealing with more dimensions than just time, it's now called the Courant-Friedrichs-Lewy condition. And it basically means that the 3D grid gets finer and finer the higher the frequency of the wave is. And to cover the full range of human hearing, that is up to 20 kHz, the grid gets extremely fine, with about 8 million points for one single cubic meter. So for a standard concert hall of about 20,000 cubic meters, that means simulating 160 billion points 40,000 times a second. There are some techniques to save on the rendering times, but there are... well... yeah. So So in the case of Waveverb and treble, they are using a hybrid model, using wave-based acoustics only for the lower frequencies, which don't need such a fine grid. I also use a hybrid model, but for a different reason, separating the early reflections from the diffuse tail of the reverb. Here's what a simplified impulse response looks like, with the initial spike, which represents the sound directly hitting the microphone, then the early reflections, which is when the sound has bounced on just one or a couple of surfaces, and then the tail of the reverb, where late reflections blend together into a diffused field which you perceive as coming from all directions at once. The balance between these three elements is essential to control the amount, character, and clarity of the reverb. So what my hybrid model does is Alright, now let's see how it sounds. The examples I'm showing you today are based on a custom 3D model of Century Hall in Tokyo, which is one of the most iconic vineyard-style halls in the world, which is when the audience surrounds the stage. And whenever I'm going to compare it to other convolution reverbs, I'm going to choose their closest settings so that the comparison is as fair as I can do. Alright, let's start with a Fazioli grand piano. First with no reverb. And then with wave-based reverb. So just with this simple dry piano patch, you can get the bigger, more classical sound of the piano. And now let's compare it to Altiverb. So it's pretty close, but on Altiverb you can hear a bit of coloration in the low end that comes from the magnitude and phase distortion of the speaker that has been used to measure the impulse response. You can really hear it if I play something down there. So the wave-based reverb is a bit more transparent, it's a bit clearer, and I really like it because it really produces the deep bass that the Fazioli is very famous for without it getting muddy. But it's still nice. It's a more cozy, more intimate sound, but again, it's not quite the instrument. Alright, let's try a harp. So Reverb sounds a bit darker than the wave-based reverb. Again, that's not to say that it sounds bad. I actually think that it sounds pretty cool, but the wave-based reverb gives a more realistic representation of what a real harp would sound in this type of space. Okay, here's a cello that I've imported from a mock-up I did of the Tears of the Kingdom trailer. So if you want to hear how my reverb sounds in a full orchestral context, you can check the video out on my channel. Alright, let's hear how it sounds dry with no reverb. And let's try something different right now. Let's try to emulate a distant recording. So that means no dry sound, but the direct sound from the speaker in the impulse response. So that means on Altiverb, setting up the mix at 100% wet, no dry sound, and enabling the direct sound right here. On top of that, I want the cello to be slightly to the right, just like a quartet recording. So I'm gonna use this position feature on Altiverb and place the speaker to the right, like this. Let's see how it sounds. And let's compare it to the wave-based reverb with the cello in a similar position. So you can already hear that it sounds more transparent. However, on Altiverb, you get the option to swap the direct sound that has been recorded in the impulse response with a direct sound from a flat impulse response. So it will not remove the coloration from the speaker in the rest of the impulse response, and it will actually remove the first reflections. But it's a bit louder. I need to get the speaker further back. It sounds cleaner. It's actually quite close to the wave-based reverb. But if you have some good ears, you can, well, pay attention to how you can localize the cello. The soundstage is a bit clearer on the wave-based reverb, but on Altiverb you get some weird reflections from the left. And that's because the position feature on Altiverb is some clever trickery, but the actual impulse response has been recorded with the speaker in front. So let's try a different reverb plugin. Let's try Inspirata, which is a very powerful convolution reverb plugin because they recorded impulse responses throughout the whole room. So you can actually place the source and the microphone wherever you want in the space. So let's see how it sounds. And now the wave-based reverb. So Inspirata is not as transparent as the wave-based reverb, but it's very good. And part of it is because I believe they use Genelec coaxials, which are pretty much the best speakers on the market that you can buy to make impulse responses. However, if you pay a bit more attention to the width of the reverb, you can hear that it's a bit more narrow. And that's because in Inspirata they used ambisonic mics, which are really nice because it gives you the ability to adjust the directivity of the microphone inside the plugin. However, it also means that the width of the reverb is directly correlated to this directivity. So if I put a microphone in Omni, it sounds mono. But if I want to increase the width of the reverb by putting the microphone in a figure 8 pattern, you get some weird coloration in the high end. And if we want to get technical about it, that's because ambisonic mics suffer from spatial aliasing, which will result in comb filtering in the high end, which is this weird coloration that you hear. So what I tried to do to increase the width of the reverb without increasing the comb filtering is running two separate instances of Inspirata, one on the left channel and one on the right channel. Both of them in Omni, which will reduce this spatial aliasing effect, but it doesn't really work. See how it gets mono at the end? And that's because these two different mic placements actually share the same impulse response for the tail of the reverb. I don't blame the developer at all. These are some perfectly normal disk space optimization stuff, but yeah, compromises. Here are some trumpets. And alongside Altiverb, I'm also going to compare Berlin Studio and East-West Spaces. Both of those have instrument-specific IRs so that the trumpets will be nicely placed in a symphonic setup. So I'm going to play some Indiana Jones, but first, let me play you a short clip of John Williams conducting the piece in Century Hall for reference. Alright, now some French horns, which are honestly some of the most difficult instruments to do reverb with, because not only do they have the laser beam high end of brass instruments, also they are facing the back of the room. So Berlin Studio and East-West Spaces, they do have instrument-specific IR, so maybe I assume they recorded the IR with the speaker facing back, the back of the room, sorry, but let's hear how it sounds. If you know, you know. One more advantage of wave-based reverb is dynamic range, because when you measure an impulse response in real life, you're limited with both the ambient noise of the room and the maximum volume the speaker can reach before distorting too much. With good impulse responses, you get about 100 dB of dynamic range. which is plenty if you don't mess around too much. So, let's mess around too much. Here are some French horns with 70 dB of compression.
Do you think that was a smooth operator? Smooth operator.
The reason I made this video is that although the technology is pretty much ready, I'm not sure how to design a reverb plugin around it because there are so many different kinds of rooms, different microphone placements, different instruments, different types of microphones, instrument placements, so it's impossible for me to create IRs for every single combination possible. So I'm really looking forward for musicians, composers, engineers to tell me what they would like to see in such a plugin. Fucking mosquito! Anyway, I do have my ideas about it, but I really want to see what you guys suggest. And in the meantime, if you are a developer looking to implement these IRs in your project, or if you are a composer or an engineer looking for customized IRs with the room and microphone placements of your choice, you are more than welcome to send me an email. Alright, that's it for me. Thanks. See you later.